The 20th century had a lot of things. It had 2 whole world wars, a depression that was so great it was called the Great Depression, a space race, and a company called Amazon was founded. But you know what it didn't have? It didn't have modern baseball trades. Well, of course, baseball didn't have anything modern 100 years ago, or else it wouldn't be considered modern now. There were still trades going on back then, so what were they like? Some were relatively normal trades, but others stood out for various reasons. With the 2023 trade deadline gone, it's time to look at some of the weirdest trades of the 1900s. A trade in baseball is pretty simple. One team gives something to another team, and the other team gives something in return. The trades that we saw at the trade deadline this year normally consist of one team getting some established major league talent for one or more prospects who might turn into something good in the future. It's not common today to see a player be traded for a live animal. In fact, it's never seen, but don't put it past the 20th century. And don't put it past Joe Engel, the owner of the Chattanooga Lookouts, a minor league team in 1930. The starting shortstop for the team was Johnny Jones, which is a 1900s baseball name if I've ever seen one, and he was having a rather bad year. Engel had enough and shipped him to the Charlotte Hornets, another minor league team. At this point, the minor leagues were far from what they were today, so although it might seem weird for minor league teams to be ran independent from the majors, but that's not the weirdest thing about this trade. Johnny Jones was traded for a live turkey. Engel was quoted saying that the turkey was having a better year than the shortstop, and the owner of the Charlotte Hornets believed that he won the trade since he had plenty of other turkeys to spare. The Hornets ended up going 131 that season, so it turns out that the turkey wasn't really an essential part of the team. Johnny Jones actually never played a game after the trade was completed. Maybe being traded for an animal takes a hit on the old confidence level, but at the end of the day, the player wasn't that good, so let's talk about a trade where a Hall of Famer was involved. That Hall of Famer is none other than Denton Cy Young. The Cleveland Spiders were interested in trading for him and called up the Canton Natchies, a team that belonged to the Tri-State League, which was a league that only lasted 3 years. Now, you might think that the Spiders would have to give a lot, but all they had to do was give the Natchies $250 and a suit for the manager, who I guess needed one. Of course, Cy Young went on to hold the all-time record in wins for Major League Baseball, and the most prestigious pitching award in baseball history was named after him. The Natchies, on the other hand, disbanded after the 1890 season, in a season where they had 4 different managers. The Tri-State League altogether shut down that same year after losing all of its good players, like Cy Young, to bigger leagues like Major League Baseball. Now, technically, this trade didn't happen in the 20th century, but it fits in with the rest, so it had to be included. This next trade, however, was in the 20th century, and it also wasn't really a trade. Joe Martino was a two-way player, playing shortstop and pitcher for the Dallas Steers in 1929. Now, unfortunately for Joe, he wasn't quite the Ohtani of his generation. He was tired of playing in the Texas League and wanted to go play elsewhere, but he couldn't because he was still under contract with the Steers. So he did what any rational person would do and offered a barrel of oysters to the higher-ups of the Dallas Steers. Martina's father had an oyster business, so he could easily get his hands on a barrel of oysters. The Steers originally rejected his offer and then countered it by raising the price to 2 barrels. Martina happily accepted the deal and became a free agent. He went on to sign with the Lake Charles Newporters of the Cotton State League. While this wasn't a trade between 2 teams, it's a rather 20th century way to get out of a contract early. Maybe some running backs in the NFL need to take this approach. Joe Martino was known as Oyster Joe for the rest of his career. Now, Oyster Joe was no Hall of Famer, but Lefty Grove certainly was, and he was also involved in an odd trade. In 1920, Martinsburg, West Virginia was struck by a heavy storm, and the local minor league team had their fence destroyed. Without a fence, the Martinsburg Mountaineers were unable to play at their home field. They didn't have the money to replace it at the time since they were a small minor league team that didn't attract much attention. But something that did attract a lot of attention was their best player, Robert Lefty Grove. The Baltimore Orioles were willing to send $3,000 for Grove, and the Mountaineers accepted the offer. They used the money to build a new fence and were able to return to action at the home ballpark. The Baltimore Orioles at the time were a minor league team, and 5 years later traded Grove to the Major League Athletics for over $100,000. They made quite the profit off of him, and it all happened because of a blown down fence, and when you think about it, a Hall of Fame pitcher was traded for a fence. In 1962, a catcher by the name of Harry Chiti made baseball history. Not for his on-the-field work or anything like that, it was because of a trade. He became the first player ever to be traded for himself. Traded for himself? Well, how does that work? On April 25th, Chiti was traded from the Cleveland Indians to the New York Mets for a player to be named later. A player to be named later allows the teams involved to decide on what player they want in return at a later date. In this case, though, that player to be named later was Harry Chiti. While playing for the Mets, he posted just a .195 batting average, and on June 15th that same year, he was named the player to be named later and thus completed the trade where he was traded for himself. While this might seem crazy, it has actually happened 3 more times, most recently with John McDonald in 2005. The Tigers acquired McDonald from the Blue Jays, but gave him back at the end of the season. In 1987, it happened to pitcher Dickie Knowles, and in 1980, it happened to catcher Brad Golden. While all of these may have been pretty odd, this one may take the cake. What happens if a player gets traded and they have to play against their former team? That's kind of weird, right? Well, what happens if that player is traded and they have to play against their team on the same day that they were traded? Yeah, that might get a little awkward, but it's not unheard of. But what happens if a player played in a doubleheader and in between the games got traded to the team that they were playing against in the doubleheader, then had to play game 2 on the other team? And there would also be a player that player was traded for, so that would mean that player was traded for was playing against the team that they played on in game 1 of the doubleheader. Makes perfect sense, right? Well, it did to the Cubs and Cardinals in 1922. After 2 disappointing performances from outfielders from both teams in game 1 of the doubleheader, the teams decided to do a straight trade for the two. Max Flack was traded from the Cubs to the Cardinals for Cliff Heathcote. In Game 1, Flack went 0 for 4 for the Cubs and Heathcote went 0 for 3. The Cubs won Game 1 4-1. In Game 2, however, things got a little more interesting. Flack was thrusted into the leadoff spot for his new team, the Cardinals, and could not get anything going his first 2 times up. Heathcote, on the other hand, was able to single in his second time at the plate to lead off the 4th inning. He was bunted over to second base because this is the 1920s and then didn't score. You see, they don't bunt anymore for a reason, and if it worked, people would still be doing it. Anyway, Flack recorded another out for his 3rd trip to the plate, and Heathcote flied out to center. Tied at 1 going into the 8th, Flack singled with 2 outs. Following him was George Taporser, and he singled. Flack went to 3rd. Unfortunately for the Cardinals, Jack Smith ended the inning with a flyout. Going into the bottom of the 8th, the Cubs got a leadoff single from Arnold Stats, then a strikeout. A wild pitch allowed Stats to move to second, putting the go-ahead run into scoring position. Marty Krug was able to ground the ball into right field for a single, but Max Flack was patrolling right field. Playing against his former Cubs, he had the chance to halt the momentum of his former employer. Stats rounded 3rd and headed home looking to take the lead, but Flack's throw was right on the money and he successfully gunned down his former teammate, already making an impact. But don't stop there. Ray Grimes was now up for the Cubs and he was able to draw a walk, now putting runners at 1st and 2nd with 2 outs, and look who's coming up from the on-deck circle. None other than Cliff Heathcote, already 1 for 3 on the day and now attempting to win his team the trade after Flack made a game-saving throw just moments before. Since this game happened almost 100 years ago, they didn't record the count in the history books, so we can't go pitch by pitch, but we all know at some point Heathcote grounded a ball to 3rd base. It was looking like the inning was over, but not so fast because Heathcote was so fast and he beat it out to load the bases. An infield single to bring up Turner Barber, who had the go-ahead run at 3rd and insurance runs sitting on 2nd and 1st. Barber laced a single into left field where Max Flack wasn't playing, so 2 runners could score, and that ended up being the winning play of the game as the Cubs won Game 2 1-3. I guess you could say the Cubs won the trade too. Well, I got a little off track there, but I think it was well worth it. Some of these trades, however, proved to be not worth it, but that's the risk you play when you play the trading game. While the trades today may be a little more refined, they are no match for the ones that came 100 years before them.